Most people think empaths leave because they're emotional. That's not true. Empaths don't leave because they feel too much. They leave because they finally see too much. And once an empath truly sees you clearly, they almost never come back. That's the part nobody warns you about. Because when most people walk away, they leave while emotions are still loud. There's anger, arguments, confusion, one final fight that breaks everything apart. But empaths are different. By the time they physically leave, they've usually already detached emotionally weeks, months, sometimes years earlier. And if you don't understand how that process works, their disappearance will feel sudden, cold, even cruel. But to the empath, it wasn't sudden at all. It was the final stage of a silent psychological process that had been building for a very long time. You see, empaths don't react to isolated moments. They react to repeated patterns. That's what makes them dangerous to lose. Because while everyone else is paying attention to words, empaths are paying attention to consistency. They notice the tiny emotional shifts nobody else catches. The forced smile, the delayed response, the sudden emotional distance after intimacy, the way someone's energy changes depending on what they want from you. And the scary part? They notice it silently. They won't immediately call you out. They won't instantly confront you. In fact, most empaths become quieter the more hurt they are. That's why people misunderstand them. People think silence means peace. But with an empath, silence usually means observation. And while you think everything is normal, they are internally tracking everything. Every contradiction, every inconsistency, every moment your words stop matching your energy. Because empaths don't just listen to what people say, they listen to what people repeat. That's the difference. Anyone can fake affection once, anyone can apologize once, anyone can act caring temporarily. But empaths are not studying isolated moments. They are studying emotional patterns over time. And once a pattern becomes clear to them, something irreversible begins to happen internally. At first, they try to rationalize your behavior. Maybe you're overwhelmed. Maybe life is stressful. Maybe you're emotionally unavailable because of your past. Maybe they're expecting too much. So they become more patient, more understanding, more emotionally flexible. This is why empaths stay in unhealthy dynamics longer than most people realize. Not because they're weak, but because they always try to understand before they judge. That's their nature. They search for reasons behind behavior. They look for wounds beneath actions. They try to see the humanity in people who are emotionally inconsistent. But eventually, that empathy starts turning against them. Because while they are busy understanding everyone else, nobody is understanding them. And that imbalance slowly starts draining them internally. This is where the shift begins. Quietly, almost invisibly. The empath starts noticing that they are the one carrying the emotional weight of the connection. They're the one initiating difficult conversations, the one trying to repair misunderstandings, the one over-explaining themselves just to keep the peace, the one sacrificing emotional energy to maintain the relationship. And after enough time, their nervous system starts asking a dangerous question. Why am I the only one trying this hard? That question changes everything, because once an empath begins emotionally auditing the relationship, they start seeing things they previously ignored. They notice how affection only appears when convenient, how emotional support disappears when they need it most, how their kindness is expected, but rarely reciprocated, and slowly. The emotional exhaustion begins outweighing the emotional connection. That's when the internal detachment process starts. Not dramatically, not overnight. Quietly. An empath almost never announces the moment they begin disconnecting. In fact, externally, they may still look exactly the same, still texting you, still laughing with you, still showing up. But internally, they are already reducing access to themselves. This is the part people fail to understand. Empaths don't suddenly stop loving people. They slowly stop feeling emotionally safe around them. And once emotional safety disappears, the connection begins collapsing from the inside. That's why an empath's withdrawal feels confusing, because there's usually no explosion attached to it, no obvious ending, just gradual emotional fading. At first, they stop sharing the deepest parts of themselves. Conversations become lighter, more surface level. You'll notice they no longer open up the way they used to. The vulnerability starts disappearing. And if you pay close attention, you'll realize something important. The empath is no longer emotionally resting inside the relationship. They're emotionally surviving inside it. That changes everything. Because once someone stops feeling emotionally safe enough to be vulnerable, their nervous system automatically begins creating distance, not out of hatred, out of protection. And here's what makes empaths different from most people. When they finally start protecting themselves, they do it completely. Because empaths know what emotional damage feels like on a deep level. They know what it feels like to overgive until there's nothing left, to constantly absorb other people's emotions while ignoring their own exhaustion, to keep understanding people who never tried to understand them back. So when their nervous system finally reaches its limit, it doesn't partially detach, it fully recalibrates. That's why empath withdrawals feel so final, because once their mind labels a connection as emotionally unsafe, their entire internal system starts preparing for separation. And the terrifying part? Most people don't notice this happening until it's too late, because empaths rarely complain loudly before they leave. They endure silently first. That's why people are shocked when the empath finally disappears. They say things like, "But everything seemed fine. No argument even happened. I didn't know they felt this way." But the empath knew. Long before you did, because while you were focusing on moments, they were focusing on patterns, and patterns tell the truth eventually. That's something empaths understand deeply. Words can lie, temporary affection can lie, promises can lie. But repeated behavior always reveals the truth. And once an empath accepts that truth emotionally, their attachment begins dying quietly inside them. This is the psychological threshold most people never recognize, the moment where hope starts collapsing. Because hope is what keeps empaths emotionally attached longer than they should be. Hope that things will improve. Hope that the other person will finally understand. Hope that emotional inconsistency is temporary. But once the empath realizes the pattern is stable, hope disappears. And when hope disappears, detachment begins accelerating fast. This is where people suddenly feel the empath change. The warmth fades, the emotional intensity lowers, the over-explaining stops. And strangely, the empath becomes calmer. That calmness confuses people, because they mistake emotional shutdown for emotional peace. But often, that calmness is emotional resignation. The empath is no longer fighting internally for the relationship to survive. They are accepting its ending emotionally. That's why they stop arguing, stop begging, stop chasing clarity, because deep down, they already found the answer they were searching for. And once an empath emotionally accepts reality, they stop trying to force connection where consistency doesn't exist. That's when the emotional energy starts returning back to themselves. Slowly, the overthinking decreases, the emotional monitoring decreases, the constant anxiety around the relationship decreases, and for the first time in a long time, they start feeling relief instead of attachment. That's a major turning point, because once an empath associates distance with peace, returning becomes very difficult. Most people don't realize this. They think empaths leave because they stopped caring. No, empaths usually leave because caring became too painful. Because constantly pouring emotional energy into unstable dynamics slowly destroys them internally, and eventually, self-preservation becomes stronger than emotional attachment. That's when the empath starts emotionally reclaiming themselves, the version of themselves they abandoned trying to save everyone else. And this is where the real transformation begins, because when an empath fully disconnects, they don't just lose a relationship, they lose an identity, the identity that tolerated emotional inconsistency, the identity that overextended compassion beyond healthy limits, the identity that kept choosing connection over inner peace. And once they outgrow that version of themselves, they cannot comfortably return to it again. That's why empath departures feel permanent, because they're not just leaving a person, they're leaving an old version of themselves behind too, a version they no longer want to become again. This is why people often underestimate the finality of an empath's silence. If an empath is still arguing with you, there's usually still emotional investment left. If they're still trying to explain themselves, they still care. If they're still emotional, they're still attached. But when the empath becomes emotionally neutral, that's when you should worry, because neutrality is often the final stage before disappearance. Not hatred, not rage, neutrality, the moment where emotional exhaustion finally outweighs emotional attachment. And once an empath reaches that point, their entire energy changes. They stop needing validation, stop needing explanations, stop needing emotional reassurance from the person who drained them, because clarity has already settled internally. And clarity is dangerous. Once an empath sees a relationship clearly, they cannot unsee it. They cannot unknow the emotional patterns that broke their trust. They cannot return to emotional blindness after emotional awakening. That's why they rarely come back once they truly leave. Not because they stopped loving deeply, but because they finally learned that deep love without emotional safety becomes self-destruction. And once an empath learns the difference between love and emotional exhaustion, they never confuse the two again. There's something people realize too late about empaths. When they finally leave, they usually leave in silence. No dramatic announcement, no final emotional speech, no desperate attempt to make you understand their pain. Just distance, quiet, controlled, permanent distance. And that silence becomes haunting afterward, because once the empath is gone, people suddenly replay every moment they ignored. Every time the empath tried to communicate gently. Every moment they asked for consistency instead of perfection. Every subtle sign that they were emotionally drowning while still trying to keep the connection alive. That's the tragedy of losing an empath. People often recognize their value only after the emotional access disappears. Because while the empath was present, their love felt endless, reliable, forgiving, always available. And human beings have a dangerous tendency to underestimate what feels permanent, until it's gone. That's why so many people think empaths will eventually come back. They assume the empathy is infinite, that the understanding will always outweigh the hurt. But what they fail to understand is this: empaths do have limits, and when those limits are finally crossed, the emotional door doesn't close suddenly. It seals permanently, because by the time an empath fully walks away, they've already mourned the relationship internally. That process happens long before the physical ending. While the other person still thinks the relationship is repairable, the empath is quietly grieving what the relationship could have been. That's why they often appear emotionally calm during the breakup itself. The emotional storm already happened privately. In silence, late at night, during moments nobody saw. That's where the empath cried. That's where they overthought every interaction. That's where they questioned themselves repeatedly. Am I asking for too much? Am I overreacting? Am I being unfair? Empaths blame themselves far more than people realize. Before they finally conclude someone is emotionally unhealthy for them, they exhaust every possible explanation first. And that's exactly why their final decision becomes so firm. Because they didn't arrive there impulsively. They arrived there after emotional exhaustion, internal conflict, and repeated disappointment. Once they finally accept the truth, there's usually no emotional confusion left, only clarity, and clarity changes an empath completely. Because clarity redirects their emotional energy inward for the first time. This is where the power shift happens. While they were emotionally attached, most of their energy was focused outward, trying to understand you, trying to stabilize the relationship, trying to predict emotional shifts before conflict happened, trying to maintain emotional harmony even at the cost of their own peace. But once they detach, all that energy returns back to them. That's why empaths often glow differently after leaving toxic dynamics. People think they became cold. No, they became self-protective. There's a difference. For the first time in a long time, their nervous system is no longer operating in survival mode, no longer constantly scanning for emotional inconsistency, no longer carrying the invisible emotional labor of the relationship. And when that burden disappears, they begin rediscovering themselves again. Their creativity returns, their emotional stability returns, their peace returns. That's why people are often shocked seeing an empath thrive after leaving, because they underestimated how much emotional weight the empath was carrying silently. See, empaths rarely complain loudly while they're suffering. They normalize pain for too long. They adapt. They tolerate, they endure, until one day, they simply stop. And when that happens, the shift feels terrifyingly final, because the empath no longer wants revenge, no longer wants validation, no longer even wants to be understood. They just want peace. That's when the emotional attachment fully breaks. And here's the painful part most people never admit. Many people loved the empath's healing energy more than they loved the empath themselves. They loved the comfort, the emotional safety, the unconditional understanding, the way the empath absorbed tension and still stayed soft. But they didn't protect the empath the same way the empath protected them. And eventually the empath notices that imbalance. Not immediately, but over time, because empaths pay attention to emotional reciprocity. Who checks in on them without being asked, who notices their exhaustion, who pours back into them instead of only receiving. And once they realize they've been emotionally overgiving inside a one-sided dynamic, something inside them changes permanently. They stop romanticizing emotional suffering. That's a huge transformation for an empath. Because many empaths unconsciously confuse self-sacrifice with love early in life. They believe enduring emotional pain proves loyalty. They believe staying through inconsistency proves depth. They believe saving emotionally unavailable people is compassion. But eventually, life teaches them a brutal lesson. Love should not require self-abandonment. And once an empath truly learns that lesson, their standards change forever. That's why they rarely return to relationships that broke them emotionally, because returning would require betraying the wisdom they suffered to gain. And empaths suffer deeply before they finally choose themselves. People only see the ending. They don't see the years of emotional labor before it, the sleepless nights, the emotional confusion, the internal wars between love and intuition, the constant attempts to keep understanding someone who kept hurting them. By the time the empath finally leaves, they are exhausted on a soul level, and exhaustion changes people, especially emotional exhaustion. It rewires how safe love feels. That's why empaths become far more protective after heartbreak. Not because they stopped loving deeply, but because they finally understand how dangerous unchecked empathy can become. Unprotected empathy attracts emotionally irresponsible people. People who take endlessly without reciprocating. People who mistake kindness for weakness. People who consume emotional energy without valuing its source. And once an empath experiences enough of that, they stop giving unlimited access to their heart. That's why an emotionally healed empath feels different. More selective, more observant, more private, not because they became emotionally unavailable, but because they learned that boundaries are necessary for survival. That realization changes their entire life. Because healthy empathy includes self-protection. Without boundaries, empathy becomes self-destruction. And once an empath fully understands that truth, they stop chasing emotionally unstable connections. They stop trying to rescue people who don't want to heal. They stop abandoning themselves just to maintain relationships. That's when their energy changes completely. Calmer, stronger, harder to manipulate. And, ironically, that's often when people suddenly want them back, when the empath stops chasing, stops explaining, stops overgiving. Their absence suddenly becomes visible. But by then, the empath has usually already crossed the emotional point of no return. Because the final stage of empath detachment is acceptance, not anger. Acceptance. The acceptance that love alone cannot sustain unhealthy dynamics. The acceptance that understanding someone does not obligate you to tolerate emotional harm from them. The acceptance that some connections only survive because one person keeps overextending themselves emotionally. And once the empath stops overextending, the relationship collapses naturally. That realization is painful, but freeing. Because for the first time, the empath stops trying to carry relationships alone, and that changes who they become permanently. That's why people say empaths become different after certain heartbreaks. They do, because deep emotional pain forces deep emotional evolution. The empath who leaves is never the same empath who entered the relationship. They are wiser now, more emotionally aware, more protective of their peace, and far less willing to ignore red flags in the name of love. That's why their silence feels final afterward, because it is not temporary emotional withdrawal, it is transformation. The old version of them no longer exists. And once someone evolves beyond the version of themselves that tolerated emotional inconsistency, returning becomes almost impossible. That's why empaths don't usually come back once they truly leave. Not because they never cared, but because they cared so deeply that losing themselves in the process nearly destroyed them. And once they finally rebuild themselves, they refuse to return to anything that costs them their inner peace again.